All right. Well, hello and welcome to Higher Education, the podcast that explores career development in public education. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Sergo, and in each episode, we'll be exploring different aspects of career development, interviewing experts, and sharing practical advice. Today, we'll be exploring communication strategies for having difficult conversations. So let's level up our skills. In our personal and in our professional lives, there are moments that we have to address sensitive issues, express our feelings, and navigate through disappointments and even some disagreements. And it's during these challenging conversations that effective communication becomes a very powerful tool. To guide us through this subject, I've asked two guests to join us. And first, we have Andrea Morgan, and we also are joined by Tim Thornburg. First, let me welcome Andrea. Andrea is one of our very talented team members here in Frederick County Public Schools. She's in the Department of Organizational Development, and she is our Support Employee Professional Growth Manager. This means she is the primary team member who is in charge of supervising and coordinating our employee training and leadership development programs for support professionals. Welcome, Andrea. We're also thrilled to welcome Mr. Tim Thornburg to our podcast. Tim is a senior manager of human resources here at FCPS, and he oversees our compliance and contract management team. He's been with FCPS for more than 5 years, but before he was with us here, he has 20 years of experience working in human resources, working with and alongside our unions, support employees, certificated employees, and also worked all across Maryland and other districts, including systems in Kansas, Nebraska, and Delaware. So before we dive deeply into the topic today, I wanted to give our guest panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves by sharing some fast facts about their work. Andrea, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experience with navigating difficult conversation? I know this is definitely a skill you've probably had to practice in your career.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sergo, for the introduction. And yes, I do work closely with department leaders to support professional learning and training for the 4,800 support staff within our system. And I've been in this role about 2 years. Previously, I was the executive assistant with the Accelerating Achievement and Equity Department. And then prior to coming with FCPS, I worked as a district manager with 5 childcare centers. So throughout my history of work, I have had to have many difficult conversations. And what I say I truly enjoy about this topic is not only learning strategies on how to have the conversation, but also on how to receive this conversation. And, both of these require skills and practice to be able to host the conversation, but also to receive this information. And I also truly enjoy the work that I've done with Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. I think she has great insight on this topic and tries to remind individuals that clear is kind and to have those arena moments.
Yeah, and we always love, I'm a Brene Brown disciple myself, so I always love sort of her messaging. But certainly, it sounds like based on your experience, you're going to have a lot to bring to our conversation today. So
well, thank you for having me.
We're glad you're here. So Tim, what about you? Can you unlock some fast facts about yourself and then what you've done in terms of your experience with having these kinds of conversations?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have worked for FCPS for approximately 5 years now. But before that, I have served in various roles in which difficult conversations just seem to be part of the norm. In working in human resources and working in labor relations, it's a given that at any particular time that you're going to have difficult conversations. For example, I serve as the chief negotiator for the Board of Education for our 3 bargaining units. And so it's very important to make sure that in the delivery of the information, the receipt of information, that you're being very clear, that you're being very deliberate, that you're taking time to make sure that you understand the other person's perspective, because many times you're asked to relay that perspective, both from the associations to the board and from the board to the associations. So those difficult conversations sometimes have to be had, but the important part is trying to find some common ground that the parties can reach so that there can be a win-win perspective moving forward. And it's all about working on relationships and preserving those relationships, because we can have a difficult conversation and we can get beyond it, but we also have to make sure that our relationships are preserved as we move forward.
Yeah, and I appreciate all of the experience and expertise you're going to bring. Thank you both for your introduction. I'm excited to dive into our topic. And so let's get started. So the first part of our conversation is going to be about the idea of how you prepare for a difficult conversation, right? So we sort of want to avoid this notion of sort of ambush conversations, right? You don't want to sort of come in at someone when you're hot and when you're heated. You actually need to really think carefully about how you have these conversations. And if you plan carefully, you typically can create an environment where you can sort of anticipate and expect where the tension will be, and it'll sort of, by planning for it, it'll create that solid groundwork and that foundation for the conversation being productive. And so first and foremost, we know that when you're preparing for a difficult conversation, you want to be clear about why you're having it, right? So what is your intent? And so you have to sort of stand back and say, what's my outcome? What am I hoping to accomplish? So being really clear about the purpose of the conversation is essential. What are you hoping to get out of it? Especially if you're dealing with high emotion. They say the worst time to plan a difficult conversation is when you're actually upset. And so you have to sort of really think carefully about tact and timing and how you approach that. So one of the first things in that planning is sort of figuring out the where and the when. Andrea and Tim, I know you've had some experience about that notion of planning. Tim, let me start with you. Tell our listeners a little bit about your decision-making process for sort of determining when and where to have these hard conversations. What are some of the key things for people to keep in mind?
Certainly, as you mentioned, timing is very important. If it's an issue that's occurring at hand, you want to make sure that you're addressing it in a timely manner. You're not waiting a couple of days or a week or a month in order to bring up an issue, because then it becomes simply an old issue that it seems like is being rehatched. So the timing is very important. The place is very important. Some people are very uncomfortable having those conversations in an open forum. You want to make sure that when you're having conversations, you're not out in the break room where people maybe can overhear and they may feel uncomfortable. You also want to consider if you say, well, how about we just meet in my office? That may not be the best place. They may not feel comfortable in your office. So you want to try to find a place that is neutral. It feels neutral, and it doesn't feel as if someone has an advantage or will have some sort of advantage in the conversation. You also want to make sure that you clearly understand the issue that is at hand, so that as you go into it, you can present the issue, you can ask questions, you can listen, and you can provide feedback or answer questions if people have questions. But you also might want to consider, are you the best person to have that conversation? Perhaps you don't have a particularly strong working relationship with an individual, and maybe there's somebody else who does, and that person would be better at delivering that message so that it is better received. So those are just a couple of things that I think about, but I also will just encourage people to not feel like they have to go in with Post-it notes or have things written down and have it scripted out. Because when you're having these difficult conversations, it really does need to come across as being sincere, realistic, being empathetic. And the goal is, number one, to try and reach an understanding of the concern, to maintain or preserve the relationship, but at the end come out with a common understanding or a common goal of how the issue is going to be addressed.
And I love what you said about this idea of, sort of thinking about where you have it and when. I always try to practice what I call the 24-hour rule, which is, I give myself 24 hours to sort of reflect, but I also don't give myself more than another 24 hours to respond. Mm-hmm. And so after, 24 to 48 hours have gone by, I then made a commitment to say, if I'm not going to have this conversation, then I'm not going to hold on to it and I have to let it go, right? So you don't want to build up resentment. You give yourself a time where you say this needs to be addressed. But the other thing reminded me of is how you create that invitation I used to say, if you really want to trigger someone's anxiety as a supervisor, you send them an email that says, see me, or, you know, come, come to my office when you get here today or something, you know. So also I think giving people context to say, hey, I want to follow up to our conversation yesterday, or I had something I needed to discuss with you that was shared with me by a colleague, and sort of at least giving people the opportunity to start to consider and think about, as they also equally have a right to preparation
Yes.
and planning for that conversation. I wanted to hear, Andrea, for you, what's your process? Sort of what do you think about and plan for as you're trying to think about getting ready for difficult conversations?
I definitely agree with a lot of what Tim was saying. And I think the location's very important. I think having, that you don't want to be too urgent in your conversation where you are coming across when there's still that emotional connection to what's being discussed. But I do agree with that private setting and that neutral setting. It is uncomfortable to go into an environment that you don't feel that you have maybe a level playing field on. So finding that common ground. But for me, the biggest, preparation is to remember what the issue is at hand and to go in with, and Tim, you said it beautifully, you said goal, right? There's that outcome you're trying to get to. So what is the problem at hand, and how do we get there as a team? How do we work together to find a common ground to get to that solution? And if you can try your best to, take the individual out of it so that we're not getting any negativity or embarrassing the individual, and we're just focusing on that common goal, it's a lot easier to address the problem and come to a solution.
Yeah, I always say, when I think about intention, typically if you're going to have a conversation with someone that we would describe as difficult, your purpose should be one of twofold. It should be, I'm either telling you because I need you to understand something, or I'm telling you because I need you to engage in an action, or usually something I want you to stop or start doing. And so I think really making sure, is my intention to, help sure they understand something or to act in a certain way. Anything outside of that, sort of the notion of telling people just to sort of tell them or to diminish them or to, that you want to avoid, certainly. So let's, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, in talking about timing, not only is it important to make sure that the timing, the relevancy of the issue, but we want to make sure that we allow enough time for the conversation, that it doesn't feel rushed, and that if we do get to a point where we need to end the conversation, that there's an opportunity and a feeling that we can get back together to continue the conversation.
That's super important, because you do have to give people, adequate time. So then let's switch a little bit to sort of the experience of the meeting itself. One of the things I've often coached people around is sort of, how do you start a difficult conversation? And I would say that this is a place some people struggle at. One of the best starters that I've ever heard is where you say, and this actually is a Brene Brown tidbit that I love to share, which is, she says, you start by saying, we are going to have a difficult conversation. And I want you to know that I'm having this conversation with you because I care about you. I value our relationship. And I believe that if we have this conversation, we can improve together. And I think when you sort of enter into it and you acknowledge that's what this is going to be, this is going to feel like a difficult conversation, but I'm having it with you as a sign of my investment in you and my care about our relationship. Because if I didn't care about you, our relationship, I wouldn't spend this time sort of having this difficult space. So just how we open that up, some people talk about I statements and this idea of, how do you talk about yourself, and you don't you want to sort of you want to be mindful of your pronouns, but just this notion of active listening. The second piece of advice I often give people is that if you know that someone actually wants to have a difficult conversation with you, let's imagine the tables are flipped, that you allow people to have space before, if you're the calm and steady party, you begin with the person who is dysregulated and you say, okay, listen, I know you're upset. And I know this is a difficult conversation. So talk to me about how you're feeling right now. Tell me what I need to know as we prepare to have this conversation. Sometimes just letting people sort of air themselves out, if you will, can be very helpful. So Andrea, I'd love to start with you this time. As you're thinking about the actual experience of having a difficult conversation, and let's just say the notion of active listening and sort of how you steer that conversation, what are some of the tips and suggestions that you have to share?
Well, I think the active listening is the key to this. I think oftentimes, we get wrapped up in the day to day, and we get ourselves in the position of kind of trying to accomplish more every day. And not to say that, there's a downside to that, but when we're having difficult conversations, it's really important that we are actually having that active listening. So we want to make sure that we're listening to understand and not listen to respond. And a lot of times when you're having those hard conversations, it can be tricky to listen to understand. And we want to just rebuttal, and we want to, kind of get the side out that we're talking about. But what's important to come to that common goal is to really listen to both sides of what's being presented, because there's always a different viewpoint and a different understanding of what's coming to the table. And in order to get to that resolution, you have to be empathetic, and you have to be able to listen to the other person. And not only does that help build that relationship that you need, right? You're building that trust. And as Dr. Sergo, you just said, we're having these conversations because we value and care about the other teammate. So to build that relationship, you have to have that active listening, and you have to have that empathy behind it so that you can build the relationship to then move forward. And I think for me, that's kind of the biggest thing is making sure that we're actively listening and not listening to respond.
Yeah, that's hard to do, particularly when, the onus is on you as the leader of that circumstance to sort of address something, right? So how do you do that? Tim, what are your thoughts in terms of the experience of how you sort of facilitate these meetings from a listening perspective? What are some of your tips and tricks?
Sure. So, interestingly, on the drive-in this week, there was a radio program, and I heard the host of the program talk about a survey in which 70% of the respondents say that they avoid having a difficult conversation because they don't know what to do. They don't know where to begin, and they don't know where to end. And so, one of the things that certainly, in addition to what Andrea said, is we want to make sure that when we're talking to people that we are very present in the moment. We want to make sure that we have set aside enough time. We want to make sure that there aren't any interruptions. We want to make sure that our phone's not ringing, and that the person we're speaking with feels that they are the most important thing at that particular moment. We also want to make sure that we are good listeners. There's a good reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We want to make sure that we are using our ears to listen, to understand, and that we're not being judgmental as we are listening to them, and that as we're listening to them, we're not formulating in our rebuttal to what they're saying, or we're not taking the time to plan our next questions or such. So it needs to feel very genuine. It needs to feel very organic. And it doesn't need, we want to make sure that we're remaining open-minded to what they're sharing, because they may provide a whole new perspective that we haven't even thought about, but we need to consider as we are listening to understand.
Yeah, and I love what you talked about. It's like the experience, right? So I think a lot of times this term difficult conversations, people automatically assume is a conflict-ridden interaction, right? So what makes it difficult, it's important for our listeners to think about, is it's difficult because it could feel uncomfortable. It's difficult because we're typically talking to someone about an area that isn't going as well as we'd like. It might be a behavior, it might be a decision, it might be something that, we're fortunate. Many of our conversations and interactions with our colleagues are very positive and sort of work focused, but there are times where we have to address employee behavior or decisions that people have made. And so I think I love what you both said, which is it's difficult because it's sort of the significance of the conversation, but the conversation itself doesn't have to feel difficult. And I think that's a really important distinction. So I want to dig in a little bit more to this idea of how we make people feel respected and heard, even when we have to address things, or even if the interactions aren't the ones that we want them to be. And so there's a lot of tools that I'm sure both of you use in order to help us reach that common ground. So this idea of how do you find common ground, and what I mean by finding common ground in this topic isn't about, let's reach consensus. It's this idea of we can all live with and support what the expectations are moving forward, that they feel matched to the situation, that they feel that they're the outcome of a fair process and an open conversation. And so in FCPS, we always say we try to get to yes, and we always try to get to yes, but we also try to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable for performing at the highest levels. And so even in conflict, we have to sort of say, we're here for kids. And so when we are sort of trying to find common ground, we always try to use our service to students, families, and one another as an anchor. So Andrea, I'd like to start with you this time. What are the ways in which you try to find common ground when you're having these difficult conversations? What's been your approach?
Well, I definitely think going back to that goal and, what is the end goal that we're trying to reach? You just said that we're always here for the kids, right? That's our reason here. So I think understanding that even when we have to have these difficult or hard conversations, when we have that ending in mind, that our conversation is going to get us to the end goal that we're looking at together as a team, it is really understood differently and it's felt differently when you're on the receiving end, right? Because you're part of the solution versus, looking at it in kind of a negative context, then it doesn't sit as well. So if you can keep that positive, what's our end goal? If we can keep that mindset that, we're not there yet, but we're gonna get there, that yet is key. And having that in consideration, I think definitely makes the conversation be heard and understood easier. And the other thing that I say that I really enjoyed at FCPS that I've noticed kind of different here that is a wonderful environment to be in when you're having these conversations is we allow emotions in our conversations, right? So, nobody wants to have a negative or emotionally heated conversation, but to not have that, in my previous life, there was the big corporations where you checked your emotions at the door. And here at FCPS, I think we value our emotions and I think we allow staff to come and speak on those and allow us to build through, what we're feeling and speaking to our feelings. And I think that helps with this as well, because you can get to that common ground when you feel heard and validated. And part of being heard is allowing your emotions to be able to be expressed. And I think that's something that happens really well here when we are having these conversations and even in our just day-to-day working together relationships. I feel that staff are validated here and that communication is wanting to be heard.
Yeah, I appreciate how you sort of describe that, which is, you're entitled to feel the wide range of human emotion. How you act on those feelings is this different conversation, right? But
Of course,
right, this idea of you're allowed to feel upset, you're allowed to feel disappointed, you're allowed to feel frustrated, that those are real human emotions and we acknowledge that they exist. And I think that's important. But what you also said reminded me of a strategy I used to use as a principal when I would have to address things with kids. And you'd get to the point at which you had to sort of bring closure, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I used to always say to the kids, well, if you were me, what do you think this outcome should be? And some people are often harder on themselves than we ever would be. And sort of this idea of, well, how do you think we resolve this? What do you think we both want? And how do you think we should address it? And so that even that idea of inviting someone into the resolution is important. So Tim, what about you? What are some of your strategies for sort of finding that common ground with employees?
Sure. So I agree with everything that certainly Andrea and you have shared. And the term that comes to mind is civil discourse. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a topic that we can both discuss, but we can find some common ground. So sometimes you start in that with just trying to have some small conversations with an individual, just as if you're meeting them for the first time, just to begin that chit chat conversation, and then which then allows you, as people begin to sort of lower their emotions about why they're there, to begin to address the topic. And so once you're able to introduce that topic, it's also important to make sure that you're asking open-ended questions, that you're not allowing the individual to simply say yes or no. You're asking clarifying questions. You're asking them to provide you with information to help you to understand. And so all of those pieces come together and allow you to have those difficult conversations. If they were easy, we'd be saying we're having easy conversations, not difficult conversations. And so trying to find that common ground with the recognition that we're not going to agree on every point. And I think that's important to share right up front. We may not reach agreement on every point, but let's try to find an area or areas where we do have agreement, and then let's try to build upon that.
Yeah, and that's sort of great advice, which is sort of keep bringing people back to those same interests that we both have. So then that takes us, we've gone through this difficult conversation, that sort of takes us to sort of the closure and the next steps. And I think it's always good to thank people, no matter what they brought to the conversation. And that expression of gratitude and appreciation is for both showing up and participating. And so I think recognizing people for how they've handled the difficult conversation or how they've been present in that conversation or available for it can really set a positive tone. But typically it's not done then. When I was a director of schools, my team used to tease me, but I used to send these emails. I called them shared memory, and it was sort of an informal way of documenting or honoring what we had discussed. Right? Not everything has to be a formal memo. Sometimes, but there is a desire to sort of memorialize things and to say, okay, we met and this is what we discussed and here's where we are. And so finding that space between formal documentation and sort of honoring what happened for shared memory, I think can be helpful. And it doesn't have to be long. It can be short and sweet, just an acknowledgement. So Tim, let's start with you this time. Do you have any tips for listeners about that follow-up process? Sort of what's the right routine or components of that?
Well, I love what you said about thanking people for being there and honoring the fact that they're in that conversation and recognizing that it is a difficult conversation. I think it's also important, just as you said, to memorialize that, because sometimes as time goes on, people forget what it is that was discussed and agreed upon. But it's also, I think, important to have touch points. Hey, are we okay? Do we need to set up another time? Can I just check in with you later to see how you're doing? And I think that's important. But just as much as beginning a conversation with thank you, it's equally important to end the conversation with thank you, because it honors the process, it honors them, it honors the fact that they're willing to engage in those difficult conversations to try and find some common ground and understanding.
I love that because, Leanne Davey describes this as sticking the landing. And she talks about this idea that like a gymnast, no matter how many impressive flips or contortions or, whatever you've done in terms of the actual experience of it, you really don't get credit unless you stick the landing, right? That punctuation mark is really where you get credit for that kind of conversation going well. Andrea, what about you? What are some of your tips about that follow-up process?
Well, I'll definitely pull from Tim's, having that touch point, I think is very important. A lot of times, we get to the end and we thank, and then there's no follow-up after, right? And so a lot of times when you're having these difficult conversations and you're trying to get to this common goal, it's really important to make sure that both parties understand what that goal is. And sometimes in the heat of the conversation, the goal or the message can get maybe lost in translation. So coming back and, whether it be, Tim, as you were saying earlier, that, the conversation needs to have let's put it on pause and come back to it another day. Or if there has been a resolution and we're thanking and we're at the end of the conversation, it's still important to come back and make sure that everybody understands how we're going to move forward and what our new path is, so that we don't, kind of repeat and we get to the new goal. And everybody understands what steps and what involvement they have in getting to that resolution.
That's great. Well, we have a few minutes left, and I want to sort of share one listener question. So we have a listener who says, they have trouble managing their emotions. And so they struggle with difficult conversations, and they really struggle with staying calm, being the calm person in that situation. Tim, what would be some strategies you would offer sort of briefly around how to help manage emotions when you are faced with difficult conversations?
So certainly, as once you're in the conversation, it's important just to take a breath, right? Before and after. It's okay to be aware of your emotions, but at the same time with that, you have to understand your body. Your body is telling you some things, so don't ignore your body language, and so that's important. You also want to make sure that you're taking breaks if necessary. You want to make sure that you're continuously, again, asking those questions to make sure that you haven't missed anything. And to say to the person, hey, we've talked about a lot of things. I just want to make sure, is there anything else that you think is important that we haven't talked about that we need to touch upon? Just giving them that permission to do so.
Thank you for that. And Andrea, would you like to build upon that? What are your thoughts about managing emotions in a difficult conversation?
I'd say this is definitely a skill that needs to be practiced. And it's also the more you can kind of focus on the situation versus the person and kind of identify what this is the situation that happened, and here's the path of how we're going to get to the resolution and get to the, kind of the end goal, which we keep going back to. But I think the more you can focus on that versus the person, it's easier to kind of have these conversations where it doesn't feel like a targeted conversation. I think we're all human and we all can get emotional. And Tim, like you said, there's times where you may need to take a break, right? We may need to step away and come back. And maybe when we step away, we're each going to think about a possible resolution or something that we can do moving forward, so that when we come back with our clear head, we have a goal that we're going to come back with. I know this is definitely trickier when there's more of a behavior concern than maybe something that wasn't completed. But I think all of these, if we can try our best to remember that there's another person there with emotions and feelings and try to focus on that goal, it's a lot easier to have these conversations.
Somebody once said to me, they practice Q-tip, quit taking it personally. That sort of Q-tip mantra is very helpful.
Right. And Dr. Sergo, I'd just say, from the very beginning, you want to make sure that you understand the emotion that you want to have going into that conversation, and how you want it to run, how you want it to end. And again, making sure that the emotion that you identify is going to have an impact on the relationship, not only in the conversation, but going forward.
Well, thank you both for your tremendous expertise today. We have about a minute left, so I'm going to sort of wrap us up today. And thank you for coming and sharing all this great insight. That wraps up our today's episode of Higher Education. We hope our discussion about how to plan for and have difficult conversations was helpful. These are very uncomfortable, but we know from talking to our experts that pushing through strengthens our stamina, endurance to do this again, but also helps make all of us better. Until then, next time, check out our Quick Bites online and join us back here for our next episode. Please keep on thriving in your careers, and don't forget to share this podcast.